Hello, this is Richard Kurin coming to you from the Smithsonian, and it's very good that we're now getting into the last week of the course, and I really appreciate the activity that people taking this course from all over the world. Over 120 nations have been and participating in the course. Today I want to talk about, at this Hangout, some of the questions that people have had, some of the thoughts they've stirred in me, and then talk about the final exercise and where we go from here and some of the issues in museology. There were several questions. Elizabeth 20B, I assume 20B is not Elizabeth's real last name, asked questions about the District of Columbia Emancipation Act and comparing it to the Emancipation Proclamation. And Elizabeth is absolutely right. The District of Columbia Emancipation Act was passed in 1862. The Emancipation Proclamation, of course, issued by Lincoln on January 1st, 1863. And there were differences. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was indeed an executive order given in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief of the military, and it didn't eliminate slavery nationwide. It applied to those districts of the South that were controlled by the Union Army. So there was still slavery actually in Union states in the North. And freedom of slavery had to wait for formal amendments to the Constitution. But what I didn't talk about, that Elizabeth's question prompted in me, was the whole notion of how those two things were different. Let me tell you something you probably don't know. A few people know. So the Emancipation Act for DC, of course, paid slave owners and compensated them for the freedom of their slavery, and then encouraged slaves to go to Haiti, Liberia, and other places. And the idea behind it was that in the spring of 1862 and through the summer and even into the fall, Abraham Lincoln was working on a deal to actually have freed African Americans go to a place in Panama called Chiriqui. Chiriqui was a kind of a land grab by American businessmen. It was a province in Panama. And the idea was there was coal in Chiriqui, and Lincoln and several members of his cabinet and others believed that once African Americans were freed from slavery, they could go to Chiriqui in Panama, mine coal, that coal would be used for naval ships and US industry in the North, and that would provide an economic basis for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of former slaves. And so that was contemplated in the DC Emancipation Act. In fact, it was even contemplated when Abraham Lincoln wrote the draft, the Provisional Emancipation Proclamation, in September in 1862. Now, interestingly enough, the whole scheme depended on the viability of that coal for burning, for fueling ships, the US Navy. And there was a question about whether the coal was good enough. And so to decide that issue, President Lincoln asked the Secretary of the Smithsonian, Joseph Henry, to test that coal. Because if the coal wasn't viable, you could not send tens or hundreds of thousands of former slaves to live in Panama to mine useless coal. They'd have no economy and they would suffer horribly. That coal was brought to this room where I'm speaking from at the Smithsonian. And Joseph Henry, the head of the Smithsonian, tested that coal, and he found that the coal did not burn hot enough, that the whole scheme would not work, that it was not viable. And he told Abraham Lincoln that, and Lincoln didn't want to hear it. He still thought that this was a viable idea, and even though Joseph Henry, the head of the Smithsonian, told Lincoln that in the late summer of 1862, Lincoln still included the idea of African Americans going, settling Chiriqui and other places in his draft Emancipation Proclamation. It wasn't until later in the year that finally Lincoln relented. He also took the advice, Lincoln did, of a guy named Frederick Douglass, who we talked about in the first week of our course. And Frederick Douglass said, why don't you enroll former freed African Americans, as well as Northern African Americans living as free people in the North, and put them in the Army instead? And Lincoln ended up following that advice. It was better to include people as part of the nation fighting for their freedom, for their liberty, rather than use them as semi-slave labor in Panama mining coal in a way that would not create a life for them. So that's a little kind of secret revealed history of that time and period. Now, several of you had asked questions about the Speedy One, had a story about the Japanese border with his or her family. There were actually a few questions. Michael Torgerson had asked questions about the Japanese internment painting by Sugimoto. And so let me tell you another story. You know, it's an opportunity here as hanging out that I can do things that we might not do in lectures. So I remember talking to Norm Mineta and Alan Simpson. Norm Mineta, when he was secretary in two presidential administrations, former mayor of San Jose and congressman, and Alan Simpson, who was senator from Wyoming. I was with both of them. Both served at different times as Smithsonian regents. And I was with them once at a dinner in Los Angeles, and they told me a story. And the story was that Norm Mineta, when he was taken as a young boy, as an internee, and sent to a camp in Wyoming. And he was a big baseball fan. And in the internment camp in Wyoming, there was a Japanese American boy. All of a sudden, in the the great, very different climate, different surround in Wyoming. But in the camp, the Japanese Americans organized themselves in all sorts of ways with committees and schools and so on. And one of the things, of course, they organized was baseball. And Norm Mineta was a Boy Scout, and he loved to play baseball. And Alan Simpson was by the camp, and baseball was hit. It went over the fence or under the fence or through the fence. And a guy named Alan Simpson picked up the baseball and threw it to Norm Mineta. And they talked. They both loved baseball. They were both scouts. And they both got to know each other as friends. And coming from very different backgrounds in life, one Republican, one Democrat, they met back up in the Congress of the United States and have maintained a long-lasting friendship that started on opposite wires of a fence that divided them. So sometimes I think, as Xavier said in the introduction to rights and liberties, there are harsh aspects of our past that have divided people, that have discriminated against people, that denied people their rights. At the same time, the United States has been remarkable in its ability to get it right over time and to correct some of those things. We're not there yet, nor is any country. But the idea that these are issues that do get addressed is a good thing for all of us. Marian Anderson's quote provoked some comments. And again, another side story to that is that we recently received the dress that Marian Anderson wore that Easter Day in 1939 when she signed at the Lincoln Memorial. We had them encoded, it had been sent by the family, but just this past year, we got a call from members of the family and said, hey, we have this orange dress with beautiful silver and turquoise embroidery. This is the dress that Marian Anderson wore that fateful morning when she was denied the ability to sing at Constitution Hall. And so for the first time in decades, we were able at the Smithsonian to take the dress, put it on a mannequin, take the main coat, put it over the dress, and reunite the two after decades to tell a story through that fashion, through that adornment of Marian Anderson's amazing morning. Now, what surprised me, and again, as I told you the last time, I'm not really a fashionista, but when you see that, you know, it is really beautiful. You know, when we see history, and I look at the film of that day, it's in black and white. It's very grainy, and when you look at the dress, this vibrant orange dress with silver and turquoise buttons and so on, you realize that history is not just black and white. It is in color. It's nuanced, and we kind of fade out history sometimes, and it's good to see that. It's good to see those things. Let me just say, also in Rights and Liberty, we didn't talk about the international dimensions of it so much, but of course we did somewhat with Plymouth Rock and fleeing oppression back in England for the Pilgrims. But I was recently returned from Berlin, just actually yesterday, and where, of course, we had the Berlin Wall that also divided East and West, and to be in Berlin and you know, just the sight of where that wall snaked around, where many, many people lost their lives, where that was a wall, as Kennedy said, you know, democracy has many faults, but it never built a wall to keep people in. And I think it was a great day for Germans, for Berliners, for really people around the globe when that wall came down. And you know, when you're in a city and you see Berlin the way it is now, vibrant and certainly back, its citizens united, you kind of look at those times and you know, it gives you a sense of what history is, to see the remnants of the wall and understood the lives that went into ultimately surmounting it and taking it down. Let's see, I wanted to talk about the passenger pigeon for a bit, because tonight at the Smithsonian, I'm actually introducing and hosting a program with Beth Shapiro, a scientist at the University of California, Santa Cruz, a MacArthur Genius Award winner, who's done a lot on ancient DNA. And her new book out is How to Clone a Mammoth, which you should probably not try in your own house. But, and it's much more complicated than you think. But Beth has been involved in recovering ancient DNA from Neanderthal remains, from mammoth remains in Asia, and also, you know, examines this issue of not only species extinction, but what people are calling species de-extinction. So we talked about in the lecture the whole issue of Martha, the passenger pigeon, who finally gave way and passed away in September 1914, was put on a block of ice and shipped to the Smithsonian, where she now resides. And the kind of question that scientists raise, and it raises a lot of ethical issues about, okay, so here's a species, there were billions of which, they were hunted into extinction, they were smoked out, they were purposefully extinguished as a species because of the harm they were doing to the environment. Should we, and what is the moral basis for bringing the species back? And so should we take the DNA, if we can recover DNA from Martha, should we revive the passenger pigeon? Should we revive the woolly mammoth? Should we revive other species? Now, this sounds a little like Jurassic Park. And if you think about it, the Smithsonian does have a storehouse of DNA, an archive of life on the planet. So should we recreate species? And, you know, when our scientists and ethicists think about reviving species, you realize that if you did revive Martha and the passenger pigeon, implanting her genes, let's say in a regular pigeon, and then breeding out certain genes and adding others over the years, conceivably, imaginatively, you might be able to bring back the passenger pigeon. But then would the passenger pigeon immediately be an endangered species because there were so few of them? And then would passenger pigeons breed so fast that eventually they would start eating American agriculture and crops and therefore have to be extinguished again? So you kind of wonder about these things, and sometimes science has the ability to do things but we as citizens, as people who have to think about these things and weigh the consequences, have to think about the ethical dimensions of, okay, it can be done, it is possible to do, but really, should it be done? And that's always a big question. Now, there were questions about, and as we start getting into the issue of your final exam or final project that you are working on, hopefully all of you are working on time and on budget. The people have asked some questions about the nature of museum work, because this exercise brings that out. And so Snoopy in Woodstock had a question about, she was wondering whether, I think it's wondering about which law in the United States sets rules for the provision and maintenance of museums, like the British Public Libraries and Museum Act of 1964. What's the prerequisite to become an official museum curator in the United States? And what activities does the Smithsonian coordinate to promote cultural exchanges with other nations, other museums around the world? Well, the U.S., there's several laws that regulate particular museums. So, for example, the Smithsonian has a founding statute that was passed by Congress on August 10th, 1864, that formally established the Smithsonian Institution, and President Polk signed that law. Now, it only took Congress, 8 or 9 years of debate over whether it should have a Smithsonian and what it should be and what that law entailed. There are other laws establishing, for example, the National Gallery of Art, the Holocaust Museum, and so on. But typically, in the United States, the vast majority of museums are founded by groups of citizens with really no enabling legislation or law. In the United States, there's probably about 17,000 museums. Overall, around the world, there are 51,000 museums, or even more. And sometimes it gets into a definition of what is a museum, and usually in museums we include aquaria and zoos as well. But you could have science centers and activity centers, cultural heritage centers, and of course historic houses, which probably provide in the United States the most numbers of museums. So 17,000 museums is a lot, and there's legislation for very few of them. Now, in some cases, you have state museums within, there's state laws that have that, but by and large, for the vast majority, I'd say, 98% of the museums in the United States, there is no law. And museums are established because somebody likes harmonicas, or beads, or clay pots, or a particular type of artwork, or they want to celebrate their mother's quilts, or they want to celebrate a local hero that fought in a war. And so people establish their own museums. Now, museums in the United States, even private ones, if they're nonprofit, and most of them are, benefit by various tax laws with regard to gifts and giving and so on. And that, so there's some legislation that helps them, but it's largely, when it comes to museums, it's a very free country, and anybody with a good idea can start a museum about anything they want. As far as official curators of museums, again, when you're talking about government museums, national museums, museums like the Smithsonian, then there are federal guidelines in terms of the job description of what a curator is and what it takes to qualify as a curator. And typically it is expertise about the subject matter. Typically it takes an advanced degree, and it takes a certain amount of experience in doing exhibitions and programs and caring for and stewarding collections. But absent that, absent the several hundred curators at the Smithsonian and other federal museums, and I'd say maybe a few hundred in state museums, curators come in all sizes and all shapes, and with all sorts of qualifications, and it's not really an officially designated title with them. Finally, what activities does the Smithsonian do to promote cultural exchanges with museums around the world? Many. The Smithsonian is active in 140 countries around the world. And we work very closely with our museum colleagues. We lend objects. We do exhibitions and programs with them. We run research projects. For example, our Museum of Natural History runs a project called the Encyclopedia of Life with museums around the planet to describe and generate data on species around the world. And you need museums around the world to cooperate. The Smithsonian also helps different countries build national museums. We help train many of folks who work in museums. The Smithsonian takes in about 750 fellows and about 1,600 interns a year. And many come from other countries and work with other museums. And the Smithsonian runs workshops in museums around the world to collaborate and to increase training, competency, and so on. I'd say the Smithsonian also learns a lot from what other museums do around the world, and other museums have various collections that help Smithsonian research. Other museums from around the world develop intriguing exhibitions and programs, and they send those to the United States. And we rely and consult very closely. I was just a few weeks ago in Egypt, for example, with my colleague from the head of the Getty Museum, Jim Cuno, advising Ismail Sarah Geldin, who is the librarian at Alexandria, which is both a library and a museum, and looking at the development of the great Egyptian museum near the pyramids in Egypt. And that is really a great intercourse among museum professionals, talking about how best to construct and define a museum and a museum program for potentially millions of tourists to Egypt to understand ancient pharaonic culture. So it's a very, very active world. But let me say, too, that museums are not only about what's inside the museum, they're about what's outside their walls. And this, I think, is a change in museum culture over the last few decades. It used to be, make the museum as pretty as you can, make it as super and great and a great experience inside. But I think we're all challenged by things happening in the world. And just like in American, in natural history museums, museums have, because they do research, because they understand, appreciate, and respect the collections they have, and know their significance, it's not only about putting birds in a case, dead birds in a case in a museum, it's how we care for those live birds outside in the environment. So in a zoo, it's not only, as we talked about the buffalo, not only putting buffalo inside a zoo, but how do we help preserve the species outside the zoo, and in some cases as in eagles in the wild. Similarly with cultures. We don't want to just encase and freeze cultures and creativity and artwork on the walls. And in the cases of museums, we want to encourage new creativity, new inventions, new innovations that we talked about this last week in the course. We want to encourage new things to be put in the museums, and that means encouraging freedom and creativity, entrepreneurship, senses of discovery and exploration, etc. And so when we see things happening as we're seeing these days in the Middle East, where we see forcible destruction of history, of museum collections, we see the denial of freedoms to practice one's culture, to live one's life, to believe in what people believe in. When we see that, when we see people taking sledgehammers to museum objects and destroying it and terrorizing populations, we appreciate the fact that what museums show is important. And they're important because they provide a link with the past, with invention, with creativity that inspires people today and will inspire people tomorrow. So museums have a wonderful purpose, I think, in terms of enliven. You know, you might think, we sometimes think of museums as kind of dead, where things die and go and rest, but they're really actively to encourage the future. And that's an important thing. Now, I think about this all the time because just as you're doing your exercise, and it's for a purpose. You know, museums are always collecting. They're always, the history did not stop yesterday. We keep collecting. and history is going to be made in the future. And maybe political history or economic history, new inventions in creativity. There are certainly new artworks created that speak to our times. And so we're always looking for new objects. We're always going to be collecting tomorrow. And so the Smithsonian's collection is at 138 million, will grow to 139 and 40 and 50 and 160, and we'll have to figure out where to store the stuff, but we'll always have to figure out how to exhibit and develop programs that are current and contemporary, to speak to new audiences a decade from now and a century from now. Now, I was asked last year, based on the book I'd done, the history of the Smithsonian's History of American 101 Object, to offer to public television in the United States my idea of what should have been collected. And this was my 2013 list. And so at that time, remember, Curiosity had been on Mars, so the Mars Curiosity rover was on my list. So just as this week we're looking at the Space Shuttle Discovery and collecting Friendship 7, well, here we have Mars, the Curiosity rover. Now we have the prototype in the Air and Space Museum, but one day one of our curators will have to go to Mars and bring the original back. The other thing I thought of collecting from 2013 was a prosthetic from an Army veteran wounded in Iraq. And you know, because of changes in both warfare and medical procedures, we have many veterans that perhaps would have been tragically killed in warfare who are now finding a life back home, and prosthetics are making these possible. I had a gay marriage certificate. Subject of some controversy in the United States, but gay marriage being legalized in 17 or more states. And I thought having that certificate in the Smithsonian would signal the kind of social changes that we see going on in our life. I had collected the Obamacare, the healthcare.gov website and its code because it's quite revealing of the controversy over the Affordable Care Act. And of course, the website was central to it. So where museums collect artwork and objects, here we're collecting code and websites. It's a little different, but nevertheless important in documenting our life. I collected a specimen of Olanguito, a new mammal that the Smithsonian discovered in South America, the Chelyabinsk meteor that fell in Russia. There was dramatic video of that around the world. A manuscript saved at Timbuktu, even though 300 or 400 years old, but nevertheless showing how people of today protect and want to save the future against people who want to destroy and erase history. So I thought it was important for that. I had Ai Weiwei's sculpture that we'd shown in the Hirshhorn, and his sculpture of contemporary that really looked at those backpacks that form the snake that was composed of children's backpacks who died in buildings collapsing in China. And it points to that kind of discordance as China develops a vibrant modern economy, but also has to deal with issues within its own society. I had a poster of the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, the historic march in which Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech and signaled and really pushed the civil rights movement in the United States. And then I had a portrait of the 4 female justices of the United States, Kagan, Sotomayor, O'Connor, and Ginsburg, again signaling women's rights. And when we look at the last week's of lecture with the women's suffrage movement, the importance of having 4 women who've held that post on the Supreme Court really strikes a chord in terms of rights equality, not only in this country, but I think increasingly around the world. So this is a vibrant, ongoing effort we have. I invite all of you to be curators and contribute to the Smithsonian and help us define the future of collecting through your objects. So thank you all, and thank you again for your participation. It's really appreciated. I look forward to next time. Thank you.